could David grow up to be a Reform rabbi, he would have said, yes, it is a possibility, even if it's one that I hope he does not fulfill. But what he could not have imagined, and it's hard to think back now 30, 40, 50 years ago, as I mentioned, or perhaps mentioned a moment ago, my wife is a rabbi. What my father couldn't have imagined is that I would grow up not only to become a Reform rabbi, which he could have imagined, but he could never have imagined, it just wouldn't have occurred to him as a possibility, that I would grow up to become a Rebbitzin. That, well, I'm sure the rabbis here have told you. Let me turn now to your rabbis. What do you call the husband of a rabbi? Lucky. Michael, okay. And he calls himself Lucky. So there you go. The point is, 40 and 50 years ago, indeed only 40 years ago, Sally Priesand was the first woman ordained. Impossible to think about women serving that kind of role. Gender roles were not expanded at that point. When I was a boy, if you were a GLBTQ person, there was only one place to live. That was in the closet. Today, political candidates seek out support from gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgendered, queer individuals. HUC, the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, even the Jewish Theological Seminary, the Ziegler School, all ordain gay and lesbian persons as rabbis. One of my students, a lesbian woman, has just become the senior rabbi of Congregation Emmanuel in Montreal, Canada. Very large congregation. She herself said to me a decade ago, would have been unthinkable that she would have assumed such a position. The point Berger is attempting to make is that this is exactly what we would talk about with an heretical imperative. You do not have to like these changes. You do not have to like the nature of the world in which we live, but there are all kinds of choices and options that are open before people. The question is, what happens in a world where there are infinite options open before people? What happens in a world dominated by an heretical imperative where transportation, communication, makes the pace of options that are open before people virtually dizzying? And then we get to his book, then, The Homeless Mind. In The Homeless Mind, Berger wants to make the following point. In a world marked by an heretical imperative where people have infinite options open before them, it serves as the solvent for tradition. I mentioned ago the world in which I grew up. To put it in sociological parlance, the associational and kinship patterns were so solid in the world in which I grew up that to have asked anyone in our family, do you opt to belong to a synagogue? Are you going to a synagogue on Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur? It would have been unthinkable. There were no real choices or options. In fact, if I still lived in Newport News and all my family was there, I probably could predict the synagogue I'd belong to, the type of friends I would have. The point about modernity in a world marked by an heretical imperative is that people come to feel homeless. Indeed, even the demographics of our community mean that the world has changed quite radically. How many of you in this room today grew up in San Diego? How many of you came here from somewhere else? Well, take a look. Just raise your hand one more moment if you came from somewhere else. Because this is the point that Berger would make. Okay, put your hands down. Enough audience participation. I'm speaking. In a world marked by an heretical imperative, part of what occurs with the mobility that also marks people in a world by this kind of communication is that if you live in a world where you have 5 sets of aunts and uncles living on the block with you and 13 first cousins, in the 23 years my family and I lived in Los Angeles, California, we did not have one blood relative who lived in the LA area. Friends of ours became the equivalent of brothers and sisters. There are children in that community who are now young adults who are the equivalent of nephews and nieces to me. And some of our friends are the equivalent of aunts and uncles to my own children, but now that I make that point, part of what modernity does with the mobility that marks living in a world marked by an heretical imperative is that it leaves people homeless. In the community in which I grew up, there was not one Jew that I ever knew, and there were only about 700 families, not a gigantic community, though in the South, a relatively large Jewish community in a place so non-Jewish, so to speak. I did not know one Jew who did not belong to the Jewish Community Center, who did not belong to at least one synagogue. I grew up in a town with 700 families. There were 4 synagogues. Knowing what I now know about Jews, the only thing that surprises me is with 700, there weren't 701 synagogues. Of course, you know, every Jew, you've heard the story about the Jewish Robinson Crusoe when they rescue him. He shows his rescuers the 2 synagogues on the island where he's been isolated. One of the rescuers says, "Why do you have 2 synagogues?" He said, "Well, this is the one I attend, the other I wouldn't be caught dead in." 4 synagogues, 700 families, but no Jew I knew didn't belong to those synagogues. As my father put it, a contribution to the United Jewish Appeal, that's the tax that you pay for Jewish citizenship. When I first moved to LA, my wife, who was from Manhattan, we had a Jewish community center nearby. We did not use it and frankly never went into it at that point. The first thing I did when I moved into the community was join it. And my wife said, "Well, why are you joining the JCC? We never even go there." And it actually, until she said it to me, it never occurred to me not to belong to the JCC. We're Jewish, there's a community institution. Why wouldn't you support it? Isn't this what Jews do? Interestingly, a Jew from Manhattan, my wife, had a different sensibility. We did join, but interesting to me, part of what you need to note is that when the Jewish community is marked by this kind of heretical imperative, and this is the challenge we face at Hebrew Union College in educating our new generation of rabbis, cantors, educators, communal workers, and the challenge that Rick Jacobs faces at the Union for Reform Judaism, is that in a world marked by a homeless mind, you have to keep in mind how transformed the Jewish world is. I do not know exactly the figures on San Diego, and probably in preparation for tonight, I should have prepared this, but I'll allow you to inform me. But I want you to keep in mind the nature of how the Jewish world has changed. In 1950, there were about 50,000 Jews living in Los Angeles. Today, there are over 600,000. Phoenix, Arizona in 1970 had 30,000 Jews. Today, there are over 200,000 Jews who live in Phoenix. What's the Jewish population of San Diego? Under 100,000. Part of what you need to note then is that in a world marked by an heretical imperative where people have a homeless mind, people move to San Diego and they move to Phoenix and they move to Los Angeles and they move to Denver and they move to Atlanta and they move to Dallas, and the first thing they do, in quotes, is drop out. What percentage of Jews in San Diego belong to a Jewish community institution in this area? 20%. That is, by the way, statistically, not so far off the norm, though do keep in mind over a lifetime, well over half of Jews belong somewhere. They come in and they come out. But we live in a world now where you cannot count on the at-homeness, the reinforcement of classical associational and kinship patterns that you formerly could. So that part of what you need to note is that modernity is the solvent of tradition, and part of what occurs in the world in which we live in the 21st century, and this is true, the fastest growing group among Jews in the 21st century are the non-affiliated. That is the fastest growing group. But now that I say that, what happens to other Jews when they move to San Diego and Phoenix from places like New York, New Jersey, Boston? What did many of you do, the first thing, or your families, when they moved to San Diego? They come into a temple. They want community. In a world marked by a homeless mind, what was that show that used to be on Cheers? People want somewhere to go where everybody knows their name. Part of what I would assert is that what you have in contemporaneous American Jewish life are what you would call antipodian trends. Remember the antipodes on a battery? The currents run in equal but opposite directions. The great irony of American Jewish life today is that record numbers of people do not affiliate, but other people affiliate with a greater degree of passion and desire for knowledge and an intensity of participation than would ever have been true in my parents' generation. For my father and mother, who were both the children of Eastern European immigrants to this country, their Jewishness was a habit of the heart. It was just something they had been reared in and raised in. To ask again, as I said before, are you going to belong to a synagogue? Are you going to give a federation contribution? Would have been the equivalent of asking, are you going to breathe? But on the other hand, I'm not certain that they had the same degree of Jewish education that you have in myriad places today. There's been a proliferation of Jewish studies, of Jewish day schools. Your Aleinu committee here, the intensity of Jewish learning, knowledge, commitment, participation is probably at a record high in terms of the history of North American Jewry. Part of what I am trying to assert is that there are still needs that individuals have, even as the sociological and technological and cultural frameworks within which we live have been radically altered by the world which we currently inhabit. People want a sense of order, of purpose, and of community. The major task that probably confronts the synagogue is how is it that it can reach out and embrace people and give them the needs that they want. If you look even at the beginning of Bereshit, the beginning of the book of Genesis, it provides a framework. Look at what it asserts. In the beginning, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim v'et haaretz. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. V'haaretz hayta tohu vavohu v'choshech al pnei tehom. The world was chaotic and darkness was on the face of the deep. V'ruach Elohim merachefet al pnei hamayim, and God's spirit hovered over the waters, and God said, Yehi or, let there be light, and there was light. What does it mean to be imitatio Dei, to imitate God? And this is what our communities need to strive to become. How do you create order out of chaos, out of nothingness? In a world marked by an heretical imperative, where people feel homeless, how do you give people a sense of feeling at home? Because the spiritual and religious and communal needs that mark individual persons are as great today as they ever were, even if community comes to be formed in different ways. The challenges that our synagogues have is attempting to program in a variety of ways that will speak to how these needs can be fulfilled for Jews in the 21st century. And the task of the Hebrew Union College, quite frankly, is how is it we educate new generations of cantors, rabbis, educators, so that they can come into the synagogues of this movement and move out into the larger world to give people this need for a sense of community, because this remains the task of our people. There was a great thinker at Brandeis University named Shimon Ravidovich. If you spell this, you get extra points on the final. Ravidovich, R-A-W-I-D-O-W-I-C-Z. Shimon Ravidovich was the first head of the Near Eastern and Judaic Studies Department at Brandeis. He was an incredibly prolific scholar, but one essay he wrote was The Ever-Dying People, The Ever-Dying People. And part of what Professor Ravidovich pointed to was that in every generation, Jews felt often that they were the final generation and that there would not be a future for the Jewish people. But the wonderful thing is that to be human means that you are capable of acting volitionally in the world, because some Jews feared that Judaism would not continue to be vital. They behaved and acted in a way that made sure that Judaism could thrive in a current and for future generations. The key point that emerges here is what we do as Jews today, our ability to reach out to people, our ability to have congregations that can be vital centers of worship, as we saw tonight, that can reach out and embrace individuals and create community through all sorts of programming, both in the synagogue and beyond the synagogue's walls. The creation of Jewish camps. You want your grandchildren to be Jewish? Send them to a Jewish camp. Even your children. These things make a difference. How you behave in the world helps to determine the nature of the world in which you live. And part of the task that all of us confront as we contemplate the future of our movement is that the challenge we confront is to behave in the world so that just as past generations may have been ever dying, but note that the obverse of that is that the Jewish people have always lived. And the task that we confront today is to see to it that in a world that is marked by rapid assimilation of the Jewish people, a world that is marked by this homeless mind and by this heretical imperative, a warm home can be created for people that can continue to provide them with meaning. One story that I would conclude with, and I'm open to questions, comments, either here or later. I don't know how you want to do this, is that let me just talk about one ritual that I experienced as a child that I still believe speaks to what the mission of our people remains, and indeed perhaps of all persons. When I was a boy, as I said, I grew up in an Orthodox background, and the ceremony that had the greatest impression upon me as a child was a ceremony called Duchenin. How many of you know what Duchenin is? Duchenin is a ceremony, the Duchan is the bima, the prayer platform. On the holidays in the Musaf service, the additional service that we don't have in the Reform movement, the Kohanim, the men of priestly descent, would stand up on the bima and they would recite the priestly blessing over the people. It is a powerful, powerful moment. The Kohanim placed their talesim, at least I remember it this way as a boy, over their heads. The shaliach tzibur, the cantor, will call out. If Arlene can be a cantor who became a rabbi, tonight I'm going to try to be a rabbi who will pretend, ke'ilu, as if I were a cantor. If every cantor wants to give a sermon, every rabbi secretly wants to be able to sing and be musical. But I remember this ceremony very powerfly. The Shaliach Tzibur, the prayer leader, would call it Kohanim, priests. And then they would answer, Am Kadoshecha Ka'amor, your holy people, as it is said. And they would recite a blessing, praise to you, O Lord our God, ruler of the universe, Asher Kiddishanu B'Kedushato Shel Aharon, who has sanctified us with the holiness of Aaron, V'tzivan Levarech et Amo Yisrael B'Ahava, and has commanded us to bless the people Israel in love. And then the Shaliach Tzibur, the prayer leader, would go, Yivarechecha, and they would answer, may God bless you. They would sing antiphonally. I never knew the word antiphonal when I was a boy, but I've learned it for, I don't know, SATs or GREs, responsively. And at the very end, they go, ah, 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 and it would go on in this way. I was told you were not permitted to look when this would occur, because God's Shekhinah, God's divine presence, literally came into the synagogue as the blessing was recited. And my father had told me, if you look, some of you may have heard these stories if you grew up in this sort of background, if you look, you will be blinded. And my father had even said to me, if you look a second time, I will say here, my father, graduate, Harvard Law School, well-educated, I guess. If you look a second time, you'll actually die. Well, I remember being 8 or 9 saying to my dad, well, let me see if I understand this. If I look the first time and I'm blinded, how can I see the second time? At that moment, I should have known it was destined that I would become a Reform and not an Orthodox rabbi. But my father did what I now know, again, parents should do in such occasions. He just said at that moment, shut up and turn around. I shared this story once with my friend Levi Kelman, who is now the rabbi at Kilat Kol HaNeshama in Jerusalem. Levi's father, Rabbi, and his sister, Nami Kelman, is the dean, actually, of HUC in Jerusalem. She's head of our program there. When I shared this story with Levi, Levi's father, Rabbi Wolf Kelman, was head of the Conservative Rabbinical Assembly. And Levi said that in the synagogue of the Jewish Theological Seminary, where they would daven, the same thing occurred. And Levi was told by his father, I don't know about the death part, but he was told, don't look, because you'll see God. Well, of course, Levi went, and he turned around, as any child would do, but he said to his father, Abba, Daddy, you told me I would see God, but all I see are, and he named the men he knew in the synagogue. And Rabbi Kelman Sr. had an advantage my father didn't have, because among the people in that synagogue, one was a man named Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. So Rabbi Kelman Sr. said to Levi, that is a good question. Why don't you ask Rabbi Heschel? So you have a lot of rabbis here. If you do have any questions, ask the rabbis. They can answer. Sometimes I will say as a professor, I do ask questions that I have no idea what the answer is, because I'm hoping one of my students will give me a better answer than I could possibly come up with myself. But with this said, he then went to Rabbi Heschel, and these are the words that Rabbi Heschel said to Levi. Levi, he said, if what you want to do is see God, you have to look beyond your partsuf. You have to look beyond your physical body and appearance. And you have to look deep within your soul, because what you will see is that there is a nitzotz, there is a spark of God that resides within you. And there actually is a spark of God that resides within every person whom you will encounter. The problem, and this is based on Kabbalistic teaching that I will not go into tonight, but basically, the problem is that these sparks of holiness all too often remain nistarim. They remain hidden, and people forget that they have them. And your task, Levi, as a Jew and as a human being, is that through the performance of mitzvot, which I would translate not only as commandments, but random acts of kindness, you'll see that those sparks of holiness that are hidden, nistarim, can be transformed into the world, and they can become gluyim, they can become revealed in the world. The task that God calls us as Reformed Jews, as part, as Professor Ravidovich put it, of an ever-dying people, is to perform acts of kindness, acts of goodness, to perform mitzvot that will allow us to create community, that will allow those sparks of holiness that all too often remain hidden to become revealed in the world. When I teach, and when I ordain individuals as rabbis and as cantors, I actually attempt every moment, I don't do it always so successfully, to think about this teaching. And I think, too, of a responsum. There's a case in the 19th century where a rabbi was asked, should we convert children born to non-Jewish mothers and Jewish fathers to Judaism? This, by the way, is in the height of the Civil War. This is in New Orleans, Louisiana, 1864. People are slaughtering one another, brothers, sisters. But you got to give our people credit. We know what's really important. Who is a Jew? Can we circumcise a boy born to a non-Jewish mother and a Jewish father? You have to love our people to focus on this. And the rabbi who issued a legal opinion on this said, yes, you should circumcise them. Why? Rabbi Kalischer wrote, Mi yodea ulai yitzmachu mehen gedolei Yisrael. How do you know? Great leaders from the Jewish people may spring from these children. Bring them in. They're Zerah Yisrael, they're Zerah Kodesh, they're holy seed. I often wonder if each of us thought every single moment that a great person might be before us, and that's who we're teaching, and that's who we're encountering, and that's who's part of the community in which we live, how might we behave in the world? I have great confidence that Reform Judaism will flourish, not only because of our current leader of the movement, but I have great confidence that it will flourish because these teachings reside at the very heart of our tradition, and they're championed by those of us who attempt to create a Judaism that will be sane and vital and inclusive and affirming of human beings. Ours may be a world marked by an heretical imperative, by people who are confronting what it means to be part of a world with all too many homeless minds. But the teachings that stand at the heart of our tradition, and which our movement champions, are ultimately teachings that speak of God, of order, of community, that champion eternal values. And our task in this community, as you celebrate your 150th anniversary, and as you celebrate your teachers who serve as the core of what your mission is as a congregation, as a Kehillah Kadoshah, as a holy community among the Jewish people, is to take then all these sparks of holiness that are hidden, and the task is to continue to make them revealed so that we arrive at what will be ultimately not a perfect, but certainly a better world. I thank you for the opportunity, the privilege of being here with you as you celebrate your 150th anniversary, and I wish this congregation great, great strength as you move Mechayil L'Chayil, from virtue, from strength to strength, and may God continue to bless this community as you move ahead in the years to come. Thank you. Amen.
Thank you, Rabbi Ellenson. I was talking to my good friend, Lisa Braun-Glaser, and she was raving about Rabbi Ellenson. And I said, don't tell me, email me. And this is what she said. He is a warm and caring mensch who is not only brilliant, but has an extraordinary ability to weave together strands of knowledge from complex secular and religious sources and deliver it effortlessly to the listener in a charming Southern drawl. Lisa, we agree. Thank you very much.
We are grateful for those words of Torah that you spoke so beautifully this evening. More words of Torah from the Bima of Beth Israel, from which for 150 years Torah has been taught, as we have strived to nurture a love of Torah in all of our members. At this sacred moment, we're mindful of the power of Torah to transform lives. Maimonides teaches that Torah comes to teach us truth, to refine us, and to help us make the world more just. Jewish devotion to Torah evokes thoughts of generations of faithful Jews who uttered words of Torah, the Shema, with their last breath. Jews running into burning synagogues to save their precious Torahs from the flames. Rabbis who were persecuted by the Romans because they continued teaching Torah in defiance of their Roman oppressors. Countless generations who came to synagogues to hear the words of Torah chanted and taught in their synagogues. So many times there have been those who tried to create a world bereft of Torah, and the Jews who gave it to the world. But we were too stubborn. The fire could not be put out. And that is for many reasons. Prominent among them has been the resolute will of our teachers to keep the flame of Torah burning. As you've heard, this Shabbat marks the last of our 150th anniversary speakers. Tonight we are particularly grateful and thank all who are responsible for teaching Torah in our congregation. We are blessed with educators who've devoted their lives to teaching, or the teaching of Torah. Our preschool